welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode. This episode is very important because we will discuss on climate actions. We have our world famous speaker, Professor David, Professor Fred Philip, Mr. Dance, Mr. Kumar, Nicholas, and Mr. Adam. So I want to start from Professor David Smith. So you are developing a very interesting strategy and many interesting business with the developing nations, and the climate change is very important aspect right now. Even the COVID-19 situation, we are observing many things happening even in Asia Pacific. So what is your observations? What do you mean by climate actions? What type of strategy we can develop to overcome from this situation?
Well, thank you so much again. I love being part of these with you. It's really interesting. If I go back to what climate action is, it really goes back and started around 2015 with the Paris Accord. But more importantly, the United Nations has a Sustainable Development Goal, number 13, which is climate action. And the title of their climate action on that one is to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. And part of what's very important when you look at climate action is the fact that it is not owned by one country, not owned by one region, but is a global call because everything is interrelated as you look at climate action around the world. And climate action has another very important consideration, I believe, as you look at it going forward. It is a action that can be driven by data. And it's very integrated to what you can do there. Another quick thing on climate action is it's going to be built on collaboration. And that collaboration is necessary between all the players in the ecosystem. So government has a role. Non-government organizations like the UN and others have roles. Industry has a huge role. Academia has a huge role as it's both on the science side and on the education side. And of course, the consumers have a role in climate action. And if you cannot have those in place, then you're going to fail across widespread climate action. So it's a very interesting one. There's a lot of statistics, a lot going on. Just this week, a report was issued that says the world is now in a code red status about climate change and climate action. So a lot going on. But it really is a place where we need to do some leapfrogging. And it gives us a ability to take roadmaps that we've been produced, follow them, some of the new changes, particularly as we look at the Internet of Things with its technologies. It's going to enable us to have much better control, much better data. And once again, data is going to be one of the keys for the action portion of climate change. And really, the data, the Internet of Things sensors, integrated with the policies, procedures, and actions is what climate action is all about. And it's a movement going forward. So thank you.
Thank you.
I think that's a good high level.
Thank you. We have our another professor, Professor Fred Philip. He is chief of Tando. So, Professor, how do you want to analyze today's topic, climate action?
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I want to present a counterpoint to what my colleague David Smith just said. I completely agree that data and analysis and globalism are completely a part of this, and yet the analytic, technocratic approaches have not backed us away from the brink to a noticeable extent. And the last time we talked about this topic, Sharif, um, most of the panelists agreed that extreme technocratic measures against extreme climate change, like climate engineering and so forth, should be only a very last resort. And we are getting close to having to turn to last resorts. So what I've been thinking and writing about lately, and I have a draft essay that I'm happy to share with anyone who is interested and sends me their email address, is can democratic governments help us avoid eco-catastrophe? It's tempting to think that an autocratic government without accountability to citizens could be more efficient in passing the laws and the instituting the practices that would, some of which are going to be very unpleasant for everybody. The practices and laws that'll back us away from the brink of climate catastrophe. And yet the autocratic governments that we've seen lately in the 21st century, whether in Brazil or Hungary or Poland or whatnot, and for 4 years in the United States, tended to be anti-environmental. So this raises hopes that we can make democracy do the job. Democracy is slow and clumsy sometimes because it takes a long time to debate and formulate legislation and make things happen. And democratic governments are talking to each other with the Paris Accords and the IOC and so forth, and they're passing resolutions that are unbelievably non-binding on the participants. So, what can we do? I told you in an earlier panel that my Asian audiences have a terrifically difficult time understanding that in places like America, the US and Brazil, that are strongholds of evangelical millennialism, and this includes other countries in Latin America especially, that people believe the Messiah will arrive within their lifetimes and lift them all, rapture is the word, lift them all to heaven, leaving earth behind. Yes, you heard me correctly. These people believe this sincerely, but others find it a very bizarre kind of belief. Now, the relevant point is that people who believe this are such a significant fraction of the electorate in countries like the United States and Brazil. And US and Brazil are both extremely pivotal countries in the climate crisis, either because of polluting industries or because of natural resources. Right? So I've been focusing in the essay that I mentioned on bottom-up measures, not the top-down technocratic measures that come from the problem-solution paradigm, but bottom-up measures that have to do with how can environmentalists engage with the anti-environmentalist portion of the electorate to turn things around so that voters can vote for what's environmentally beneficial for their countries and for the world. And there are other panelists today who I want to give the floor to. So let me come back later, if I may, Sharif, with the further thoughts about these bottom-up approaches, most of which are going to rely on theories from social psychology. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Fred Philip. Thank you, Madam Durgadash, for joining today. Now I want to give chance Mr. Dan. He is from Transhumanist Party, so hopefully his thoughts and everything will be very helpful for our youth community. Mr. Dan, how do you want to analyze today's topic, especially climate action?
It's an emergency, and we need to treat it like one. This is a spaceship Earth, all hands on deck situation with this sixth IPCC report. It documented some really dire warnings. The biggest one, I think, is the potential disruption of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, otherwise known as the Gulf Stream. And if we disrupt the Gulf Stream, it will literally plunge billions of people into disrupted weather patterns. There will be food scarcity, huge climate refugee migrations. So that is a really bright red line we don't want to risk crossing. And it's not just the climate; it's really the whole biosphere is being disrupted by human activity, species extinction, and loss of soil and biodiversity, soil microbial biodiversity. But I think we have the tools to change this. We have the internet. We have things like GIS, Geographic Information Systems, which is sort of the why of where. You can do very comprehensive analysis of citizen science, how it's impacting you and your local situation. I just downloaded a carbon capture tracker. There are apps that let you track your footprint. Right now, humanity is using the footprint of 2.5 Earths. That's obviously not going to be sustainable for very long. So you have to know where you are to know where you're going. So use science. Get apps like Capture. There's many different ones that will track your footprint, and set a personal goal to achieve the same goal your city or your country or the world should be meeting. We really need to become carbon neutral as soon as possible. 2030 would be nice. A lot of people are shooting for 2040. That may not be soon enough. So I'd say one great program is called solardividends.org. There's a professor in Santa Cruz, Robert Staten, and it's a plan to create universal basic income and total end of fossil fuel reliance in one lifetime, in 50 years, by setting up solar farms. And now with the new iron air battery technology, these batteries can actually go for days and balance the load. So we have the potential to, in very short order, create a completely renewable electric grid. Also, interconnecting the electric grids of the world would lower the price of power. There's so much we could do, but I'll leave it there. And thanks for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Mr. Dan. Madam Durgadash, your organization actually solving a very interesting things, especially water purification is a major challenges when in South Asia and Asia Pacific. So how do you want to analyze today's topic and how your organization can contribute more for solving the climate related challenges? Madam Durgadash.
Thank you, Sharif. Happy to be here as always. And the topic we've talked about before, and climate change, like Dan said, is a here and now problem and cannot be postponed for later. I think some of the areas that I'd like to touch upon in today's conversation is about climate change and food security, especially coming from India, where we already have a over-bludgeoning population. And with climate change, you see the top countries that are affected by climate change, other than Canada and Germany, which are amongst one of the world's richest countries. Most of the other countries are poor countries, and I wouldn't say India is necessarily poor, but with a large population and with a large number of that population below, poverty lines, climate change can have a devastating impact, especially with food security. We already have a low shortage or yield of food for our growing population. No one's getting any less hungrier, and we still need to feed the population. So when we have either drought or the monsoons, which are which end up becoming either cyclones or tsunamis, and we have flooding. Either way, we end up with affecting our food generation, and that has a huge impact on food security for the country. And so, as always, I'd like to focus my attention from, from an Indian perspective, and where we come from vis-a-vis all of these world problems. Our company here in Europe produces water from atmospheric moisture, and it's something that we hope will kind of change the way people look at water and their access to water, drinking water specifically. And out of the 1.2 billion people, there is a significant percentage of that population in India. And in the next few years, there will be at least 20 cities without access to water, drinking water. And then we have the issues, like I said, of agriculture and water required for agriculture. So between drought and floods, we are left with a huge problem in front of us. And it's countries, the bigger countries, that are adding to the problem of climate change more dramatically than the smaller countries like India or Rwanda or Kenya, who are all going to be affected by climate change. And I think that's something that the bigger countries in the world need to address very quickly, and see how we can help the smaller partners in the short term.
Thank you, Madam Durgadash. Today's session actually very interesting for me because there is a combination. We have expert panelists, like professional group of people like Professor Fred Philip, Professor David Smith, Mr. Dan, and Madam Durgadash, and we have our young panelists. I think they can bring some new strategies. So now I request Mr. Adam. So how do you want to analyze climate actions?
Thank you, Sharif. Good to be here again. Good to see everyone. Well, to tackle the climate issue, I would like to second what Professor David Smith said. We obviously do need to think globally to address it and to do something about it. Needless to say, a lot of the topics, issues, and subjects we talk about on this show are developments and effects which have global ramifications from start to finish. We need to get more and more comfortable occupying a more global, all-encompassing international mindset, and it's one of those urgent problems that won't be solved by thinking provincially or provincially. It won't be solved by one country or a handful of several countries or by just one continent even. And furthermore, like with a lot of issues like this and others, there does seem to be a bias, particularly from within the West and its populations, funny enough. And there does seem to be something of a bias that the West is the main perpetrator in all of this, and that the West should bear most of the blame as the one civilization, or super civilization, that is the most responsible for much of the negative climate changes. And this may have been closer to the truth during other periods in history, but now the world is in far more of a globalist state than ever before. This is the most global our world has ever seen, probably. Borders between nations, countries, groups of countries the borders seem to be at their most permeable, where cultures mix, information is shared, data is exchanged. One corporation can extend across multiple countries and more than just one continent, where its CEO, say hypothetically, could be someone from China, with the person preceding them being from Germany, followed by someone from Brazil, for example, so on. So with this perspective, the world truly is small, or a lot smaller than it ever was, and the most fragile. Well, it's always been fragile, but in the grand scheme of things, the planet and its inhabitants are more vulnerable in a dire situation where the clock is ticking. So we need to address it and treat it as such. Because yes, whilst the clock is ticking, we have already passed several checkpoints already by now where and when it would have been far more opportune and timely to really knuckle down more, to start trying to address it without leaving it longer and longer, which is what is happening because we, for example, are still discussing it here. So yeah, the world is small, but that doesn't mean our civilizations and our individual well-being and life qualities are any less important simply because it's a massive universe. And so, as I was saying, it's probably not fair to pin all of the blame onto the Western world and its influences. And because the rate China is developing, there's a lot of it coming from China, there's a lot of it's coming from India and industries in South America where there's deforestation. So we need to step up and try and solve it for the whole world putting its heads together. Thank you. Thank you, Sharif.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Kumar, how do you want to analyze today's topic? Yeah.
Um, thank you, Sheriff. And lovely to join. And I'm really happy to see Durga also. I mean, partners sitting here. So, as you said, I mean, there are two generations. One is people who have seen all the data and all the effect of climate change, and another generation we are trying to address and observe all this climate impact. As Mr. David was saying, the data is key here. So unless we know the data, the real values, we never know, I mean, where we stand in terms of atmosphere, in terms of pollution, in terms of all this greenhouse gases emission. So I would like to address, I mean, from my point of view, I mean, since we have come from a refrigeration industry, I would say, I mean, 50, 60 years back, we used CFC, carbon fluorocarbons, like which is very harmful. And later, after 30 years, we realized it's polluting our atmosphere, and we had a huge gap in the atmosphere near the poles. And later, we turned out to be HFC. That also, I mean, after 20 years, we learned, I mean, that is also polluting our atmosphere. Now we are in HFO. So we are in the third generation in terms of polluting our atmosphere. But still, we are trying to address the better solution to reduce the overall temperature of our planet. Like, see, as in 2015 in Paris Summit, every country, almost 86 countries have signed in that agreement saying we'll bring down 1.2 degrees Celsius, the overall temperature, and every country is trying to fight. I guess, I mean, Morocco and one more country in Africa, they have done phenomenal job in the last 5 6 years, and China especially, they've introduced a lot of solar panels. But only thing is, like, they also manufacture coal extraction machineries. So that's kind of contradictory. And of course, I mean, Sweden and Denmark becomes the first fossil-free country, fossil-free addicted countries, and that sets a good example for rest of the world. And we can follow the same path and achieve that climate change. And there is still a long way to go. I think in 2050, if we can achieve at least zero point 0.2 degree lower in our entire global temperature, that would be a great job. As a human being, human race, we can do that. And yeah, that's how I see for the future.
Thank you. Thank you. We have our friends, Mr. Nicholas. Mr. Nicholas, can you hear me? How do you want to analyze today's topic?
So many analysts already, such a multitude. I guess I'll focus where people haven't focused. And a big thing recently has been electric cars. For example, the USA is trying to push more electric cars. And honestly, this, to me, this isn't be something that a lot of Americans want to do. They like their engines. So to compensate that, we have another alternative for carbon engineering, where we actually take CO2 out of the air and make fuels for cars. So we don't have to change cars at all. We don't have to change designs. Cars can stay exactly the way they are now. And the CO2 produces fuel extracted right from the air, right, goes right into cars. That would be something that a lot of smaller nations could start getting into right away. It's very efficient, and it's very how do I say, eco-friendly. Another thing I guess we haven't been discussing is plastic, and the biggest scheme in the world today is something called greenwashing. Corporations are saying that we can recycle plastic, and it's simply dishonest. It's not true. Plastic is one of the hardest things to recycle. Even with the UK's new proposal for a tax where a product needs to be 30% recycled plastic, it's impossible. They're going to lose a lot of money simply by not being able to find people that can recycle plastic efficiently. So plastic is a huge thing that the world doesn't think about or does think about, but not enough. And only about 40 to 50 countries in the world have depositable bottles where you take your glass back to the shop and they give you a new glass bottle filled with soda or water. And it's really low. So between plastic and CO2 fuel, those are two things where I think every nation can get on board and start being more responsible. Again, simply plastic is not recyclable. It's not. It's a lie. More than anything else, glass and tin and metals are the way to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Uh, well, this is really good discussion, especially when we are discussing on the climate actions. But I have, even our audience have keen interest. They love to learn more about climate policy. And we have our world famous policy expert, Professor Fred Philip. He is expert in techno policy and this kind of thing, which is very important for developing nations. So Professor Fred Philip, how do you want to analyze about like policy developments, because policy is very important. Even developing nations, they face a lot of challenges when these green technologies and other things come. On the other hand, there are strong lobby from oil and gas and other big corporations. So how we can develop a better policy based on green technology?
Well, thank you. As I said, I'm focusing on trying to make democracy work. And if democracy doesn't work, then anything you and I might say about policy is just going to be hot air in the breeze here. I'm glad that some of the panelists have mentioned China's behavior and about cars. China is, and I was talking about autocratic regimes, China, of all the autocratic regimes, is the most sincere about fixing the climate change problem, and yet their overriding objective of that regime is to consolidate power. So when that objective runs up against the environmental objective, well, they build more coal plants if that's what they think they need to stay in power and avoid uprisings, as one of the panelists mentioned. Now, in the United States, I think people would be very happy to have electric cars, except so many people are so poor that it's all they can do to maintain their very old, highly polluting internal combustion cars. We have very little public transportation in the United States. Poorer people need their cars to get to their work. We do not have generous government subsidies for the acquisition of electric cars. And even if it was subsidized, our minimum wage working class would still not have sufficient surplus funds to acquire an electric car. So think of the United States as a Cuba filled with antiquated cars, but 300 times bigger than that island. So people have been foreseeing catastrophic scenarios. And before I detail one of these, let me just preface it with a couple of background items. We have tension between the knowledge economy and the capitalist economy. One of you just mentioned that the corporations are still behaving badly. There's greenwashing. There's the outsourcing of the polluting parts of their activity so that they can say that their own activity is very green. Then they sign these corporations, which I'm using as a proxy for capital in the economy. They are signing these non-binding international agreements and getting a lot of public relations mileage out of it. They are arguing with their knowledge workforce. You've read the news about the engineers at Apple and at Google arguing with the owners of those companies, which represent capital, So there's a lot of pushback against the transition to the knowledge economy that was predicted by Peter Drucker and Ikujiro Nonaka, and even by Karl Marx. So with those things as background, the scenario that many people are drawing has the super rich, and part of the background, of course, is the extreme wealth inequality that exists in many countries. The super rich are retreating into enclaves and bubbles where the climate action is not as severe as elsewhere. The super rich are co-opting in this scenario, co-opting some of the less morally upright knowledge workers to maintain their bubbles. And the knowledge workers who do not want to submit to that are cast into a very unpleasant outside environment that's been ravaged by desertification and extreme heat and probably also by regional nuclear conflicts. And the very poor who have neither money nor education are, well, they're in a terrible shape, so we won't go there. And the thing is, this scenario is all too plausible given recent events. The Washington Post is noting how rich people are congregating in enclaves in rich neighborhoods already, and that location makes a huge difference to people's prospects for maintaining their wealth. Peter Thiel and some of the other cryptocurrency billionaires are building bunkers in New Zealand because places like New Zealand and Tasmania, and to a lesser extent Iceland, are isolated islands that are suffering less than other locations from the extreme heat and sea level rise and so on, and are agriculturally self-sufficient. So in many ways, this dire scenario is getting more and more realistic, and it helps us to understand the parties involved. And let me see if I can show you this. Can you see it? This shows some of the actors in the current drama. We have survivalists, people who are, building bunkers in New Zealand, and you have people who are actually trying to solve the problem rather than run from it. We have individualists, people who think that they can go it alone, and we have communalists who understand that we all depend on each other. We have the tension that I mentioned between the capital economy and the knowledge economy. We have tension, the rich versus the poor, the millennialists, the evangelicals who think that they will be raptured to heaven versus the environmental mainstream. We've got people who are ready to take responsibility. We've got people who think that this is all somebody else's problem, or the problem belongs to everyone, so somebody else will take care of it. And then, of course, you've got those people who are spreading misinformation and conspiracy theories, and they are opposed to the folks who are devoted to scientific evidence. So we have a lot of gaps in communication and in attitude that need to be bridged before we can get a unified electorate in the democracies. And whether you represent this as a policy problem or a dialogue problem or a taking responsibility problem, the problems exist. And if I'm able to come back later on the panel, I'll talk about some of the psychological mechanisms that might be brought to bear to bridge these gaps. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fred. Professor David Smith.
Fred has done a great job of outlining some of the elements there. I think though, as you look at the issues on the government side of putting these action changes in past, it's real interesting. If I look at the list of countries that have signed on for aiming to net zero emissions and others like that, the list is long. It's very long. And it's clear from looking through the geopolitical impacts for policy that there's real leaders there and there's some real laggards there as we look there. For the developing nations, climate change finance has been classified as but the target for that one on the international banks and others, it's still very low. As part of their overall giving to developing nations, the percentage dedicated to climate change is only about 1% of their overall gifting and loans to nations as well too. So you have to begin to look at the policy elements around that to really explain where it's going and what you can do with it. One of the very interesting things to me is if I begin to look at what has happened in the very recent near term, is that you've seen things like the recent report that just came out that I referenced earlier. You know, in UK they have now trying to form a big bang for green recovery fund to help accelerate it across all of those. You know, on the 4th, DHL announced all electric cargo planes as part of where they're doing. You can see this throughout many different places, but the challenges we mentioned before is trying to move these actions forward and what you can do. And you know, Adam talked about electric vehicles, and I really liked the discussion we had earlier from Nicholas about the drivers and the constraints going forward with that, because there's tremendous drivers and constraints as we look at these transitions. Now, we've mentioned before, electric vehicles are great when I look at them as part of the solution, but then the ability to charge them does not make them as green as they can be. You know, I mentioned earlier on climate change, as I've taken some trips lately, I see big diesel generators powering the EV recharging station. And so it's that ecosystem we often talk about that has to
Exactly.
really change and adapt to make those pieces work. Also, on a policy side, we really need to look at how to modify the economic development goals, where climate leadership in business needs to be important, clean technology, energy transition, but they have to foster good jobs. They have to foster enhanced jobs. They have to be able to look at the leadership to say, I need to educate my citizens. I need to educate my workforce. I need to educate my government leaders on how to do this in a way. That is how you begin to change policies, and it's policies and industry that have to be adapted to make this work. And as you get that done, then you get sustainable communities. And the sustainable communities, as they're duplicated and spread, will help reverse some of the trends that we're seeing. One of the very interesting things at this point in history, community advancement, community transformation might be easier now than at any time in the past. as we're transitioning from so many jobs and manufacturing to different approaches now, as we're looking at how to put sensors into the communities. Um, and the whole concept of smart transportation, smart government is a time that we can use to our benefit for climate action. And so it's really putting together the roadmaps for each community, for each nation, but with international coordination. Once again, I can do things locally, but it takes international to really take the climate action levels that we need today. And that's the policies that need to be coordinated. I can change my community, but I can't change the international response. And that's where the real action's needed.
Thank you. Mr. Dan, he's from Transhumanist Party. They are also expert in policy development. So how we can develop better policy? Already Professor Fred Philip and Professor David bring some interesting point. What is your thought? How do you want to analyze for policy development?
Well, I think we need to elect people to government that treat this like the emergency that it is. I think Marianne Williams is saying the same thing. I just typed something in the chat that is never talked about, and that is the spent fuel cooling problem at the 443 nuclear power stations around the world. People don't realize that the fuel, when it comes out, is still 90% radioactive, and it has to be cooled and submerged underwater, and it evaporates about 100 gallons a minute, and that power comes from the power grid. Now, the power grid is very subject to failures through things like sabotage, cyber terrorism, coronal mass ejections. We have a very tenuous power grid, and people have said if the power grid goes down, for an extended time, you will see massive casualties and civil disruption. Some people estimate like 90% casualties within 6 months. So this should be at the top of government's radar screen to come up with contingency plans for this. The nuclear cooling pools have diesel backup generators. They're about the size of locomotives, but they only have about 2 weeks of fuel on site. And if there was an extended power grid outage, we are just looking at immense toxicity of the whole biosphere. We've designed this kind of trap for ourselves, where if the power grid goes down, the biosphere is going to get massively toxified by the imagine like 400 plus Chernobyls around the world. So securing the grid and securing those spent fuel cooling pools is one of my top priorities. I'm going to be running again for city council here in Thousand Oaks, California, and talking about these things at a booth on October 17th. So if you're in Ventura County, stop by the street fair booth on Sunday. SWE 17 is the booth number. I'll be unveiling lots of solutions that are in the United States Transhumanist Party platform. I think it's one of the most science-based platforms in politics. It's about getting government to pay attention to health and science, and not this political trench warfare that the duopoly of most parties seem to be engaged in. So thanks for letting me contribute that.
Thank you, Madam Durgadash. Madam Durgadash, can you unmute, please?
Keep forgetting. I always forget. I think you need to have a button to remind me every time, Sharif. But yeah, so
Okay.
just listening to Fred and David and Dan, coming from such experience and a wealth of wisdom on these topics, I think I have a far more simplistic approach. There has to be a top-down and a bottom-up approach, according to me, right? There are those who are involved in policies and policy making and enforcing policy, and it is a long, hard journey to get those things to happen in government, even in the most advanced of governments, advanced of countries. I think getting policies, getting two opposing political parties to agree and pass bills is not an easy task. And in countries like developing countries like India and elsewhere, where politics is a completely different beast, getting policies to address these kind of issues are, are something that I don't think they see as near term. We are faithless in India, right? Everything is, well, God is there; He'll take care of things, and so it's always for the future. And it's very rare that we actually look at it and say, oh, you know what, this is staring me in the face and we got to fix it now. So yes, there are policy makers and policy people who are involved with creating policy and enforcing policy, and I think that's a very good approach. But I also think a bottom up approach is very, very relevant and important today, because it's in the hands of these other younger people who are here today, right? They are the future, and what are they doing about it? Not, let's not talk, let's do. So even if you reduce our consumption of animal protein by 50%, you're reducing 40% of carbon footprint. It's as simple as that. Change your diet a little bit. I'm not asking everyone to become vegan and vegetarian, but reduce it if you can, and you will contribute. Don't try to fly so much. You don't have to have every holiday by taking a flight to go elsewhere. You can just go to your nearby village and or nearby forest, and you can still have a holiday. Just reducing the amount of transatlantic flights that we take to go visit a exotic location, we tend to forget. We're so consumed by taking that holiday, we forget that we're contributing to carbon. And so we can just cut short our long distance holiday plans a little bit. And so I think there are lots of these little things that we can do with food and with travel by, the office sharing solutions that came up, like WeWorks and others. There, share a car, you know. I know the US has very poor public transportation. Having lived there for 20 odd years, I had to have a car and I had to drive it to work. So it is difficult, I understand. But where possible, you know, take a cycle. It's good for you. And where possible, uh, share a car with someone else. So I think there are little things that individuals can do, and I see Fred's point about community versus the individual approach. But I think it's not a one or the other. I think it's a combination that needs to work together. There are those who have to work with communities and make changes at a community level, and there are things that we all as individuals can do and contribute. And all it takes is one mind to change and say, listen, I'm going to cycle tomorrow. I'm cutting down my diet by not eating so much animal protein. And if I do it, then my family does it, then my friends and my relatives do it, and then slowly it permeates. And we got to make that kind of change by involving the younger generation to address their future. It's not my future, it's their future. And so I think that's very important to take a dual pronged approach, both top down and bottom up. That's what I would say.
Thank you, thank you. So we have our young panelist, Mr. Adam. So what do you want to add, especially when we think about policy development? Unmute, please.
I forgot that I turned it on. Thank you, continuing on a little bit from what I said before, I was thinking about the bias towards the West, where people, Westerners themselves or otherwise, place a high proportion of the blame onto the West, and that the West should feel the most guilty for contributing the most to this crisis, even if that is not strictly true. Maybe, I mean, if anything, Western civilization is in the lead when it comes to ecotech, green activism, and nature-friendly alternatives to industry process. Correct me if I'm incorrect. So countries that really are contributing the most damage environmentally need to be confronted and not appeased so much. But I suppose then you have ethical and moral considerations when it comes to pressuring or appeasing governments in other countries that want to sustain self-governance and other such considerations like corporate espionage and such. But so do the ends justify the means? Well, that is a question we have asked ourselves millions of times since the dawn of man, and this leads into the consideration that lots of different nations are at different stages of development, which complicates things somewhat. And I was enjoying what Mr. Fred Phillips was saying, and he spoke about the super rich strata of society, billionaires mostly, and millionaires, and of course billionaires have drawn quite a lot of attention to themselves recently, most recently in the case of Bezos going up into space very recently, and controversy that caused because many people thought it was something of a whimsical folly. And of course, before that, Bill Gates has been circulating around the news and social media platforms. And even more recently than Bezos actually going into space was the controversy caused by billionaire Larry Page going on a holiday to Fiji using a privilege they have over there called the blue lane for the super rich, when ordinary people are banned from going there on holiday. So people have been advocating for checks and balances to be drafted up and put in place that work to try and prevent one person from having that much money. And again, Mr. Fred Phillips addressed these billionaire enclaves and bunkers, safe houses, safe rooms. What about the billions and billions of everybody else? What about the rest of us? Again, that highlights the ethics and morality of making demands about what someone else should do with their own money. But I think barely anyone would lose sleep over putting caps and ceilings that prevents the possibility of any one individual from becoming a billionaire. Because of course, this kind of megalomania, this kind of megalomaniacal, what I like to call master of the universe syndrome, when someone has an astronomical amount of money, wealth, power, and influence. This master of the universe syndrome is a very real threat to the integrity of living settlements and their infrastructure and the quality of life for those living in them. So this kind of anti-super rich legislation to prevent this might be an ideal tool in the toolkit to start solving this issue to help protect the environment. Thank you, Sharif.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Kumar.
I was thinking about when you ask about policy, what policy is driving all this? Like, we affected the climatic condition. What sort of policies is set in order to do that? I just go back and see. I mean, I thought industrialization. See, we want to speed up a certain process. We want to feed everybody. We want to create a lot of products, and that made us. That I mean that was the problem, I would say. But I'm not saying I'm not against industrialization, but as in 2015, um, the Paris summit, they said carbon tax. Still in India, I mean, I would say, I mean, I don't know, I mean, how many people are following the carbon tax? I mean, how they maintain the carbon neutral. I'm not, I mean, clear about it because the awareness and the education on the carbon tax has not been clear here. I mean, still people are following, and of course, I mean, any product for that matter. I mean, Dan was talking about nuclear stations and their cooling system. See, every project has their life cycle assessment. I mean, when you do that, I mean, you'll end up in knowing what sort of byproducts we create when we do a process, how that will affect the climate. But in a lot of projects, we say, I mean, we have a good social impact, but we never consider the environmental impact. When we talk about environmental impact, that gives a clear path to us in terms of industrialization. And also, I would like to talk about when you say the electric vehicle. See, I've been calculating all this, um, the the energy consumption in electric vehicle and the regular diesel and the petrol vehicles. The problem is the recycle of lithium-ion batteries. I mean, still there are a lot of people figuring out. I mean, how do they recycle the lithium-ion battery? That's when I mean, one of our panel members was suggested about iron. I mean, the aluminum batteries or iron batteries, the air batteries. That was a key. I mean, where we can eliminate the recycling process because in aluminum batteries, all we have to do is fill the water and then consume the aluminum and then waste it out. So yeah, that kind of innovation and that clear life cycle assessment has to be done so that every country can follow the same policy and implement the same industrialization. That will help us. And of course, I mean, Durga was saying bottom to top approach. Yeah, I mean, I can see, I mean, it's an individual's responsibility to take up that challenge. And I mean, every home they have to conserve the plastic use, and then they have to recycle their water. They have to recycle. They have to put the solar panel to lessen their energy consumption. All this, I mean, individuals can take it up, but still, I really worry that, I mean, this is a burden which has been posted by last generation, in the last era. I would say in the last century, everybody was talking about GDP. Everybody was running behind the GDP, and they just gone really deep. And now this generation, the new goal has to be set. We have to be focused on environmental impact, so that whatever we lost in the last century, we have to get it back. So for that, yeah, the policy has to be redefined and implemented. Thank you, Sharif.
Okay. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Mr. Nicholas.
Again, a lot of different perspectives. And I guess as far as policy goes, that can go from the ground up. And it's a bit controversial, but I'm going to tell it again. It's hemp. And if it seems silly, but it is the best thing that can happen to a lot of economies, because it could rice is a very demanding food for water, and it causes 2.5 of the globe's CO2 emissions. Rice, just rice. And hemp can solve that problem too by eating hemp seeds instead of rice. Fuel, clothing, ethanol, a lot of alternatives can come from hemp. A lot of jobs, a lot of alternative, career opportunities can come from it too, where these bioengineers will develop alternatives to our other ideas. Like cotton. Cotton is a disaster for our environment, and again, hemp would fix that. India alone, if they switched from cotton to hemp, would probably lower carbon emissions by 10% a year. And that's amazing. Just 1,400,000,000 people would do that. As I already brought up, carbon engineering, this is something that can also help a lot. There's plenty of CO2 in the atmosphere. We just pull it right back out and use it for fuel. I brought up as far as policy goes, I want to see plastic taxes. I want to see people paying more for using a plastic bottle, so much that they won't want to buy plastic anymore. That's something big, and I think that would help everybody in the long term. It might be convenient to buy a plastic bottle, but that convenience is harming everybody at the same time. We need more deposits. We need more people doing the deposits. As far as everyday people, the super rich going to New Zealand to hide in their bunkers. This is actually a genuine concern. This happened when COVID first popped its head into the USA, and the stock market crashed, because all the super rich pulled their money out and went to hide in their bunkers in various locations. This is the truth. So in a global crisis, we can't rely on our leaders, because our leaders are the super rich. Especially in the United States, the average politician makes millions of dollars, and the average American makes 60 to 50,000 US dollars a year. The average politician is not the average American in the USA. And as far as every American moving to South America to combat the future of climate change, is just impractical. So they have to do something there. In China, I'm suffering no ozone. When it's 30 Celsius, it feels like 45 Celsius, because there's just no ozone anymore. They're doing better. Plastic recycling is big, but it's just not enough. We need the real alternatives that can help bottom up, as our I'm sorry, I don't want to say your name wrong, as the doctor said, that everyday things. And I think that's hemp. I think hemp could give jobs, and it can give a lot of alternatives that we really need. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Nicholas. Thank you. It's really, really great discussion, especially for our audience. I'm sure it's a great learning. So I request all of our audience share our content with your government, with your corporations and academy. And we are actually developing our board. We have our board of advisor, Professor David Smith, Madam Durga Das, Professor Fred Philip, Mr. Dan. These are the expert panelists. They will join in our board as a board of advisor, as well as we want more like ambassadors and fellow, like from the youth communities, because we want to develop some projects. Already we are developing our university projects in Malaysia. So we need lot more support and collaborations. Hopefully it will be many more interesting initiative for all of us, and by this way hopefully we can solve many problems, and we need collaboration. We are open for collaborations. Thank you everyone for joining today's session. I directly want to go for the concluding remarks. First Professor Fred Philip, then Professor David Smith, then Mr. Dan, then Madam Durga Das.
Can you hear me now? I had trouble unmuting.
Yes.
Yes, thanks again, Sharif. I do believe that our individual efforts.
I'm sorry, I think internet problem. Professor David Smith.
I might start Fred's sentence where he left off. Yeah, our individual efforts are totally necessary to move this forward. Public-private partnerships are necessary to move it forward. Looking at the whole concept of the technopolis, where the government, the citizens, academia pull together, are necessary to affect climate action. And taking that concept of that collaboration, of that technopolis approach, and taking it global is what will finally reverse this. The big countries are a contributor, but they're beginning to put many efforts to handling it. Some of the mid-sized countries are the next target that really has to come in to bring them back into a sustainable future. But we have to remember, this is an ecosystem problem. It's not one technology, one approach that is causing it. It's a whole ecosystem that we have to attack. And it's how do each of these ecosystems, how do each of these systems interact with the other systems? And so it's a complex problem that requires complex solutions, which requires complex action on a global scale. And that's what will allow us to take climate action to the next level of accomplishment. And Fred, back to you, I guess, since you're back online.
Okay, thanks,
Thank you.
David. Yes, I had a connection problem. I do believe that our individual efforts to reduce our throw off of carbon and methane are socially very important. And yet, in terms of the objective amounts of our contribution to the climate change, it's minuscule compared to what corporations are throwing off, and especially the world's militaries. They are the biggest polluters. And corporations, we talked about their misbehavior earlier in the session. Why are they misbehaving? The global capital liberalization that was actually pushed for by Western corporations created such huge pressure for short-term profits, because CEOs are afraid that if they don't show impressive quarterly returns, that the newly mobile capital investment will divest from their company and go invest in some other company, perhaps overseas. So this puts terrific pressure on CEOs for term profits. And what we have is a lot of CEOs who are hoping to show impressive returns during their tenure and then retire before the effects of extreme climate change really have an impact on their corporations and on their countries. And so from a policy perspective, well, of course, they're spending huge amounts to lobby governments to allow them to continue to operate this way. But given the urgency of the problem, both consumers and governments should be pressuring these CEOs, and the severity of the problem lets me feel free to use a crudity here. These CEOs need to shit or get off the pot. Now, in terms of the opposing actor groups that I showed you earlier, Dan put in the chat that there's a lot of common ground between them, and yes, that's exactly it. The role of these psychological theories that we will now have time to go into is to find that common ground, articulate it, and to then form a shared view of a future that's desirable for all the parties. It is absolutely useless to confront their facts with our facts. I think that's been amply proven so far. We have to talk about their feelings and their visions for the future and how we can agree on these things. There are two kinds of problems in the world. There are problems that can be solved and problems that can only be made less bad. I think we have to, at this point, conclude that the climate problem is the second kind. We have to get off of the problem solution paradigm and combine top down and bottom up and have start dialogues with the people who have very different beliefs from ours and try not to be confrontational as we have those dialogues. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Fred. Mr. Dan.
Yeah, always great to hear great ideas from great minds, and so glad to be among them. Fred, you're talking about finding that middle ground between these people, and we need to be aware of things like the study that shows when you present facts to people, sometimes it just entrenches them more in their beliefs. So
Exactly.
you have to argue intelligently. Sometimes just argue by example, or use humor or gamification or lots of ways. People won't do things unless it's fun. Fundamentally, I mean, that's a secret that fitness instructors have found, that you can come up with a great routine, but if it's not fun for people, they're not going to stick with it. So I think we need to make solving the Spaceship Earth challenges fun in some ways, and there's lots of gamification that can be employed. So I know there's a giga scale carbon challenge that Peter Diamandis, the X Prize person, and Elon Musk are funding. So that's something that's been noticed, is when you make a contest out of something, you actually get 10 times the activity toward solving a problem than you would if you just tried to buy, that amount of activity. So that's something to keep in mind. I think to wrap up, I'm promoting something I call universal basic opportunity, and that's something we can do by using soft power. We can patronize people that have similar beliefs, and we can boycott people that have harmful beliefs. And we haven't really rolled out that capability in society to the extent that we could. So it's something I call quality progress opportunity networking, or Cuponomics, and I'll be publishing more about that and rolling that out as the weeks progress. So thanks again for the panel today, and I'll yield the floor.
Thank you. Madam Durgadas.
I so agree with Dan. Make it fun, and suddenly you'll have the world following it, right? So cool. And I think that's really, though it sounds so simple, I think it's a very powerful way to get things done. And I wish more people will find a way to, share these ideas through some kind of a way that makes it seem like fun or a game they are playing, because I think more of the world will start to follow it. Just to conclude, I'd say there are just some simple things that one can do as individuals, and like I said, there are the greater minds at force that will work on policy and policy change and policy enforcement. And so I would just say simple things: speak up as much as you can as an individual. If I speak up in my home, I speak up in my community, I speak up with my friends, I think the message will be heard. Power our homes with as much renewable energy as we can. Weatherize, battle cold and heat through simple mechanisms of, how we can take care of our homes and protect it through insulation. Invest in only energy efficient appliances. Many a time we go to the store, we look at the ratings, and most of us don't even know what it means. So I think understand what it means and try to invest only in those appliances that are energy efficient. reduce water waste. This is a key topic. This is a topic that's very close to my heart. Save water, reuse water, generate alternate sources of water. Primarily, don't waste it. Um, Eat the food we buy, eat less if we can, and make less of it meat. It's a simple way to reduce carbon. Buy better bulbs. And last but not least, if required, pull the plug. I mean, simple things that one can do. And if one can do, then many will follow. And then hopefully policy and the top-down approach will also come and meet at some point, and we can make the change together.
Thank you. Mr. Adam.
Thank you, Sharif. I like Mr. Nicholas's expansions on the super rich. Our leaders aren't presidents or prime ministers or even royalty per se. It is the billionaires and the banks, and it shows the two big Bs. So we will see what happens. And Mr. Dan rightly highlighted the possibility of cognitive dissonance, and that it might take longer for some than others to get to a certain level of awareness. And it can happen with people who it might seem more hopeless for them to get with the program, but with patience and using tools like humor and little humorous Trojan horses and things, it can be done. So, yeah, thank you, Sharif.
Thank you. Mr. Kumar.
I would say, we were in a perfect circle earlier. Now we are just missing the link. And all we are trying to say is that we just adjust that link using multiple innovations or our regular day-to-day practices. And now, I can see, everybody is part of this climate change. So everybody has to put their hands together and find that missing link and connect that circle back. So all what I say is that will help us. Maybe it'll take another 30, 40 years, but still we can connect that circle. Thank you, Sharif.
Thank you. Mr. Nicholas.
I don't like being last. Too much responsibility. I appreciate all the different perspectives that were here tonight. I'm actually also a transhumanist myself. And although Americans are pretty anti-socialist, a universal basic income would solve a lot of problems around the world, in fact. So that's something I like that Dan brought up. Am I paused?
No.
No, okay. Just the biggest takeaway I take from everyone here is that there's so many layers to the problem. I always want to think about what's something everyday people, and that's advocating the things I try to advocate: carbon engineering and hemp. Those are things everyday people can fight for, and they can use and try to learn how to do.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Nicholas. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's session. This session is really, really helpful, I'm sure, for the academicians and for the policymakers, and especially those who involved with industry like Madam Durgadas. They also can learn many interesting points. Thank you, Professor David Smith, Madam Durgadas, Mr. Dan, Professor Fred Philip, my young friend, Mr. Adam, Mr. Kumar, and Mr. Nicola. This is the way that combinations of expert panelists and the youth panelists, and with this kind of things, I think we can solve many problems in the futures. So climate change is real. Climate change, we have to work together, we have to work hard, and definitely we need the collaborations in between developed nations and developing nations. And by this way, hopefully, we can solve upcoming challenges. Thank you, bye-bye, and take care.
Thank you, Sharif.
Thanks,
Thank
Sharif.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.